Okay, we are back with another summer series with a highly respected person in the industry. The previous videos have all been trying to hit original and unique content rather than repetitive stuff. Today, you probably have never heard of this guy. He's very shy and he doesn't appear on media much. We are very happy to welcome Adam Chernoff. I'm obviously joking because he's very visible, very notable within the industry. Just to quickly summarize, Canadian, ended up down in South America, bookmaker, slot machine designer, back up to Canada, and now with covers.com. Did I leave anything out that's important within that?
Yeah, it's actually not too bad. I'm going to start using that version in future intros I have to do.
The first question is going to be the way that we met, because you reached out to me during a difficult 2021 stretch for you. And I cannot compliment people enough when they admit that they have betting failures and their openness about it, because I respect that a great amount. Go through the process of developing a system that fails and how you pivoted. And I'm specifically referring to at least golf. I know golf is your passion, and you tried to make that work, and you gave up. What's that process, and what's the transition from a difficult 2021 NFL season to this year? Or actually, you had a tough 2020.
I was going to say 2020, yeah. Because I was like, things went okay last year, but the year before was rough.
Excellent season last year. So how do you transition and pivot in those circumstances?
So I'm thinking back to 2020, which was rough because it started off really bad. Week 1 was like a 2-8, 2-7 type of week. And it was red the whole season. Going from that to 21, the biggest thing I guess I realized or noticed was I was overthinking and overanalyzing and just putting in way too much work into the details. So there's something I remember very vividly from 2020 were a lot of overs that I was playing based on like secondary injuries. So I put an enormous value on cornerbacks or safeties being out and was just immediately reacting to news without thinking, really overvaluing that. And so it was just taking a massive step back. And I think what you're referring to specifically is you were listening to the podcast, and I remember you messaging and saying how different I sounded to start last year, which went very well versus 2020. And it's one of those things that I never noticed, but it was really helpful to get your side to be like, you're thinking and speaking completely differently about teams this year than you were last year. And it's just making it a lot easier. So I think that was as basic as it sounds was probably the biggest thing.
You love golf. You tried to make it work. What was the process of giving up?
Golf was frustrating because I would be very good at identifying somebody who would potentially struggle in a round or someone who I could circle as a guy who would be like a play on spot for a certain round. But what I was really bad at was equating both sides of the matchups because you could never get the ideal matchup in many cases. And so I could handicap sort of half of it well. And a lot of the conclusions that I were jumping to would just be to say, like, if a guy was a play against that I had circled for a round or a tournament, I would just bet against him with other guys, just assuming that it was a good bet. But I was really bad at making a good price on both sides of it. And so, again, it was just something I really overvalued where I was too focused on half of it. And I couldn't get to a good point where I was making a decent number for both sides. And it was becoming too costly. And so I just stepped away. And I honestly haven't bet golf in more than a year now. I've just been away from it. So it was disappointing, but it's a tough one to beat.
I deleted the banner for Ron. He has a question about.
No, that's all right. I know my own question, but I like to do follow up too. So you mentioned 2020 started off bad, week 1, week 2 in NFL, but teams didn't have a preseason. there wasn't, there was COVID. We didn't know a lot of things about the rookies and so on. I mean, how much do you have to take away from the fact that maybe it was a strange year to begin with, especially if you're betting weeks 1 and 2?
So it was definitely. And I still get criticized by a couple of people who I'm in a chat with who are very good bettors. And before that season, like, remember June, July, and August, how dead it was. Everyone was at home and it was all chatting back and forth. There were so many nights in like late July of 2020 when we knew there wouldn't be fans. And I was just like adamant that it didn't matter. There were not going to be fans in the stands. It was fine. Wasn't a big deal. And that was kind of the biggest thing, is now we hear quarterbacks speak about 2020 and they're like, oh, we could audible whatever we wanted. We had no issues at the line of scrimmage. It completely changed the game. But it kind of goes back to that point where I was so busy thinking about other things that I missed the most simplistic part of it. And with the preseason, it was another example of that, where it's like, I was like, it doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. Nobody plays in preseason anyway. I was completely so far down the rabbit hole, so to speak, that I just missed the obvious stuff. And so I definitely agree with both of that. But those are just two massive mistakes on my end.
Okay. Well, that gets back to a future question that I'll have about self-evaluation. But my current question was just, being in Canada, what's the sports betting landscape in Canada? I've heard some starts and stops and some horror stories. And I've been following the states, for example. Every state's a little bit different. You hear good things about some of the states and bad things about some of the states. Well, what's going right about new legislation for sports betting? And maybe, in your opinion, what's not going right?
No, nobody says anything bad about betting, Ron. There's never been a bad word said about sports books in the regulated market.
There is in California, because we don't have it.
It's coming. It's coming.
Okay.
So we have legal betting in Ontario, which population-wise, if you were to combine Canada and the United States, Ontario would be the third biggest state in both countries. It's a province, but just population-wise, there's about 16 million people that now have access to regulated betting. And it's a lot of the usual big players that exist in the States. The big difference is the advertising restrictions. So you're not allowed to promote bonuses. You're not allowed to promote really any like boosts or special offers or anything like that, unless it is on their website and you have like knowingly gone to FanDuel.com, for instance. But anytime that they're reaching out to you, they can't do that. There's situations where you can opt into lists and you get promotions, but it's a lot less sort of invasive from that perspective, which I think is a good thing, because there's probably in every single state that has regulated betting too much betting advertising, which is a weird thing to say is it better, but I think we kind of either we get tired of it or it's too much or it's too in your face. So I think Canada did that right. Perhaps what they've not done as well is handle the rollout of other areas of the country. It's going a lot slower than what we've experienced in the States. And I don't think there's enough awareness at a government level to just really understand how to handle it. So I'm worried that a lot of the places coming up in the future are not going to be prepared to handle it. And it's going to be just kind of reliving this cycle again and again and again, where we have to improve despite all the states showing you how to do it or how not to do it. And now Ontario is showing you the same thing. So we'll see what happens, but that's kind of how it is right now. About half the country has access.
What's the good and the bad from the U.S. that you see?
Well,
quickly,
I said nothing was ever said bad about books, but I think we know that's not true. The good, I think, right now is at least places are trying to be different. We're seeing a couple books become a lot more player friendly. There's a couple places in New Jersey that I don't think are announced yet that are pushing to be live before football, which will start to change the conversation, I think. I won't give too much away there. We'll see what happens. But that's maybe in the next month or so, we'll hear more about other places trying to get into the space. I would say that the bad from the book side in the US is a lot of how customers are being treated. And like the limiting thing is a discussion in itself that I think is there's two sides to it, but we're starting to see, specifically, I was working on an article and I don't know what's going to come of it. There's one sportsbook in particular that's a major brand, and they are now requiring what they call enhanced verification. And the extent of this from multiple people who are not long-term proven winners. Like, these are regular bettors that deposit.
Just making deposits, yeah.
Yeah. And they're betting like much more than your average player, but it's because they just want to bet that much. And what they're requiring is a 15-minute phone call where you have to talk about your employer, what you do for a living, explain the origins of the money you use to deposit into the account. And in as many cases, you have to provide like bank account statements. You have to provide employer verification letters, things like that, to show how much
income.
you make. It's and that is so far beyond the line of what is right and wrong that worries me. And there's similar stories. I'll just cut you off for a sec, Chris. In India, massive country, more than 1 billion people. The similar brands operate in India, and what they've put in place is a responsible gaming act that was issued by the government. And so it's now at the sportsbook's discretion to flag accounts if they deem that you have a problem. So the self-reporting is off of the player. But here's what happens when this occurs. When they deem you're a problem gambler, your account is frozen and you have to pass a course that the government makes you take to prove that you don't have a gaming problem or that your awareness is at a certain level. But you cannot access the funds in your account until you have that certification. And the backlogs for some of these courses are either in the weeks or months. And in many cases, they're happening in other countries, specifically in the UK, which operates in a different language. So now the goalposts keep moving, right? And so, like, where does this stop? Because there's nothing stopping it now. And that's the bad in the US.
Well, and then there's a recent story out there where somebody deposited $9,000 cash. They wanted the income statement. They wanted their history with a competitive book.
Yeah.
And some other things. And not only that, they couldn't even get their money back until they got a check several weeks later. So some of this stuff is pretty bad. Just pivoting. You have a daily podcast, which is very good. The current series that you're running now goes through all 32 teams, and it's short and sweet, 12 minutes approximately. Good stuff. You're all over media, and you always are coming up with these different thought lines that I think are very original. Do you naturally find these different angles of value, or do you intentionally try and be different, which is what Ron and I are trying to do on these videos? What are your techniques to come up with this unusual data or perspective?
I think it just stems from betting, and you guys would probably agree that a lot of the advantages you find in betting are from going where other people are not, or identifying where everybody is and saying if that is right or wrong. And it's not just like a blind fade perspective, but oftentimes where, like we were just talking about the 2020 NFL season, clearly there was something that was being valued differently by bettors, by modelers, by the books, that a lot of people couldn't adjust to, myself included. So
I thought it was variance, because I had extreme positive variance in 2020 and extreme negative variance in 2021. I look for it to be kind of in the middle this year.
And that's the good spot to be, but I think it applies to handicapping too. Like there's I did the New England Patriots preview. Everyone's in general talking about what happened last year, the injury luck, the fumble luck, the strength of schedule differences. But it's very few people will go and talk about, like, okay, from a team perspective, what's going to be different in 2022? And not just namesake, but is this going to be a better offense? Are they going to change tendencies? Is it going to be a different defense? Are they changing tendencies there? What does the coaching changes have to do with it? And so if you read a lot of previews, they're all very similar. They have the same sort of 5 or 6 points per team. But if you want to be different, you kind of have to have like variance in the handicap, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that I think leads to different angles, different thought processes, and has sort of unique content behind it. It's not just regurgitating what else is out there.
So I have a pet peeve, and it's these sports books that do it for a business. They're not bookmakers anymore. Like when I grew up in the handicapping business in the 80s, 90s, and stuff like that. They move on air. That's my pet peeve. They're not paying attention to their own shop. What are your thoughts on that kind of bookmaker shop, the business of bookmaking these days? And then pivoting, is there a pet peeve you have about what's going on in the industry?
So thoughts from a business side, or thoughts from a better side?
I think thoughts from a better side, as far as, does that make you mad, that the fact that your book, all these books, as soon as you see a red movement, you're going to see a red movement across the line on a Don Best sheet. I mean, no one's going to keep the line. No one's going to worry about their own clientele. They just look at the market.
So I don't think it bothers me, because I've got very good at understanding the time implications between when those books move in reaction to other books. So a good example, this morning, Patrick Mahomes was announced as going to be playing a quarter by Andy Reid at a press conference. And so almost immediately, I went and bet the over at 35. And it was like an immediate reaction at Chris. It was an immediate reaction at 411. We saw other places just start to kind of flicker and start to move up a little bit. But it's the same books almost every single time that aren't moving that quickly. So it wasn't until circa they went from 35 to 37 and a half. It was just a 2-point move up. And then that triggered everybody else. But from a better side, like if I know which places are moving and what they're moving on, and I know which places are going to follow those places, then it kind of tells me the story of what's happening within the betting market itself. So I don't mind it, because I think I'm efficient enough where I have a couple places where I can play that are slower, and I know what's coming, and I know if something's coming out, I know I can go there. If it was all different opinions being taken like it used to be, for me, because I started in 07. So I honestly didn't know what I'm doing till maybe some would say even now, but probably 2015, 2016, like just before regulation, once I got out of the bookmaking side. So I would think that if everyone had an opinion and was hanging their own price, for me, it would be more difficult to know what was coming and know what was right or wrong. I feel very comfortable now that I know these places are going to move on air, they're going to copy, and which places actually matter when they move and not. So I'm imagining back in the 80s and 90s, you had to know the bookmaker. Would that be fair to say, Ron, where you're like, this guy values these things or not? Because it was more of a personal decision behind the counter.
It would be more of a personal decision. It would also be based on, they wouldn't move it if they knew your tendencies. If they knew I bet X number of underdogs, that if a line moved somewhere else, and they may not even know before the internet or before all the connection, they just wouldn't move the line, not even on information. They're going to move it based on whether or not their clientele is going to cost them some money.
Right. And for me personally, like if I put myself in that situation, then right now I look at the screen and I don't really have like a personal relationship to the 25 books I have on the screen, but I know which ones are good, which ones are bad, which ones are fast, which ones are slow. That's it. If I put myself in that situation that you were describing, it's like, okay, I have to know 15 different books, 15 different bookmakers, and I got to know 30, 40, 50 guys who are betting just to try and make sense of what's going on within the market. So it was probably a lot more, like, I think it would be a lot more fun, I would say, from just like a social perspective. But from just an execution perspective, for me right now, I would think I would do a lot worse in that environment, because it's so much more to have to keep your mind around.
Some of the bookmakers that or the bookies that I used to deal with, they had opinions. So they wouldn't move the line. They thought they were right, and sometimes they were, and so they wouldn't move the line. And I kind of like that cat and mouse game better than just moving it whenever you feel like moving, whenever you do that. But that's just my pet peeve. You might have something in some other area.
I spent a lot of time developing relationships with who was running the sports books in town. And it was a two-way streak. If they had a bad number, I would tell them. I wouldn't take advantage of it. If somehow they wanted a ticket back, I would actually return a ticket. And it's just a shame that those days are obviously gone, because you can't build those relationships, because you'd have these bookmakers that would need certain action. They say, will you take this off my hands for a point, or, et cetera. It's sad that those days are gone.
No,
I want to transition.
Yeah.
I want to transition because I have noticed, and I don't know whether you have, but it seems like non-modelers, people that are just handicapping off of information, instinct, whatever their process is, they're having more success than even modelers are having in a lot of cases. And it's been kind of going on. So how valuable do you think it is to have a metric-based starting point? And how long does this success of non-metric type handicapping continue, do you think? I mean, have you seen, is the influx of all these new bettors having an effect on the lines and the results, so to speak, versus the people that are metrically, biased and kind of sticking to that way?
So I'll push back on this. And Ron, it's not my top pet peeve, but this is up there where where everything gets kind of bucketed into like absolutes. And so I know that the tweet you're talking about that started that. And I think it's an interesting discussion. But to say that we know with any sort of certainty, like which types of bettors are doing really, really well versus whether or not they have a model, I think that's a stretch. And we just don't know. There's so many people that are not publicly sharing any information that they're betting on whatsoever in so many different places that I don't know if it's true to say one way or the other. I think what's being misinterpreted as what that's being described as, where it's like there's this type of bettor who doesn't use any modeling or numbers having success. It probably comes from a summer where draft betting was very open and public, and people kind of for the first time really understood what was happening with drafts. And I think now, even within the first week of NFL preseason, people are kind of being presented with a lot of content saying like, here's what news matters and here's how it moves the line. And these are things that whether you're a modeler or you're just a handicapper or whatever your stance is in betting, if you know what's actually happening, like you've known these things are true for years and years and years. So I think that side of it and just how it's just ingrained in any conversation is becoming so much common or so much more common that we're kind of believing that it's this like change in who's winning and who's not. I think it's just being talked about more.
How important do you think there is to have a metric based of some sort, whether it's a model or stats that you use as a foundation? How important do you think that is to the average handicap, specifically NFL?
You need both sides of it, in my opinion. I would say that I'm a lot more confident in my own evaluation of watching games, of understanding personnel, and then I think I'm quite good at realizing what went well and what did not within a game after the game is completed and how that applies to the market. But at the same time, I would have no real baseline to go off of, or at best, a very volatile baseline based on just my emotions and how I'm feeling that day when trying to interpret 32 teams. I would be a mess if I didn't have some sort of numbers setting kind of an unbiased baseline. But there's noise in everything that I think is fair to say. But you have to have both if you want to really be good. It's tough to do one or the other.
That's what I agree. Ron?
So we've had Brad Powers and we've had Paul Stone, and one constant that we've seen, I apply it as well, is that we're busy in the spring and the summer doing college or doing NFL, getting ready for the next season. Now that you've had 10, 12 or so of the previews that you've done, What do you do in the summer to prepare for that? What's your kind of preseason game plan as you get ready for the next year?
First of all, nobody can compare anyone to Brad Powers. He's honestly, I don't know if he's well or not, but the level of intensity that he puts into everything is so far beyond what anyone else can do that it's, nobody else is in that conversation. Paul's incredible on his own right, but Brad that's too much. Like it's like March and he's breaking down spring practice.
That's too early for me.
Yeah, no chance. I would say another thing I think I do well is never really, I would say, turning off the sort of mental intake of information. And so my wife would find it not the best thing in the world, but it's just you're always taking in new things. And I think what I do well in the spring and summer is sort of latch on to information that comes up sporadically. Like I don't go out of my way to seek it out. I'm not saying I'm going to spend 3 hours and I'm going to spend half an hour on these teams to try and keep up. It's sort of like throughout April, May, June, July, you're just taking in what shows up. And by the time you get to like the previews that I'm starting to do, that I started at the beginning of the month, it's like, okay, you kind of list everything out and you're like, here's 5 or 6 teams I know nothing about because it's probably been quite quiet. But then here's 20 that I've heard these tidbits about or these coaching changes, and kind of lay it out and just keep building. So it's not like a set process, but it's something that is sort of mentally occupying my head to some extent 300 plus days a year, where you're just slowly accumulating info and noting it down and then returning to it later. So it's a bad answer, but it's just kind of constant.
You touched on the mental aspects, which I was going to ask later on. How do you keep it? You're visible. You're doing so much stuff. How do you keep it all going? Do you have habits or a process that allows you to refresh, or are you all in during this NFL season? And if you do have these techniques to kind of escape, what are they? And how long can you keep this energy level up? It just seems like you're everywhere.
Yeah, this season's going to be excessive. I don't know what next year looks like, but this is kind of the all-in season from a content. So we'll see if I break down. If I make it, I'll be impressed. But I honestly, Chris, the podcast helps me a ton, because I think if I didn't have that outlet of the podcast where I'm basically talking to myself in this room, sort of getting everything out of my head about everything that I'm seeing, if I didn't do that, I would probably end up in a giant mess, because it just doing it in a weird way, as it's built an audience, it's allowed me to like say everything out loud. And I notice so many times when I'm doing the show in the morning that I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. That doesn't make sense. It's like a reverse journaling almost, where it's like, if you write something down, you feel better about it. But so that helps a ton to kind of keep it fresh. But other than that, just doing the shows, I just really, really enjoy it. I like being on the radio. I like being on camera. So it's not like extensive work for me to do that. So it's kind of natural, but in a weird way, it really sort of helps to get all the thoughts out. And it also produces a lot of really good conversation from people watching that bring up things that I've never thought of before. So I don't know how long it goes on for. I don't know how sustainable it is, but it's really, I find it really helpful in kind of a weird way.
I think that's an underrated answer, because when Chris and I were doing our divisional previews, we were literally on the fly bouncing ideas off of one another and strategies. And when you verbalize it, or for me, when I write these previews and stuff like that, if I think it, it's not the same as if I write or say it. So I understand it completely from a networking. And I think people who watch this should understand the value of having those conversations.
I did a chart the other day. So it was just really simple. It's like, here's the team that I previewed. Here's what they ranked last year in yards per play on offense, on defense. And it's like, in 2022, are they going to be better or worse? And then how confident was I that that was going to be the case? And I sent it to a couple of people, and it was like, really agree here, agree here, agree here, strong disagreement on this one. It's like, okay, why? And you're talking about it, and you're like, oh, you're right. Okay, so I'm really high on that. But it was in relation to New England. So I think the Patriots go really pass heavy. And the person I was speaking with, he's like, I don't trust Patricia at all because of this, this, and this. And so, like, my handicap that I've sort of reaffirmed on all these shows that I've been doing is for a number of things, but I think it all stems around the Pats going really pass heavy. But I sort of mentally blocked out that bad idea of Patricia might ultimately torpedo this offense. But he was really adamant about it. So it's like, okay, so my confidence level on that went down a touch because I respect what he says. And had I not sort of verbalized that, like you're saying, Ron, like I would have never got that insight.
Yeah.
And I may have been way off because the answer is usually in the middle if you have a group of smart people.
Yeah, I subscribe to the John Madden way of how he handled Stabler and those guys. They passed like crazy in the first half, and then when you adjusted for that, they ran the ball down your throat in the second half, protecting and expanding on leads. So, maybe New England goes in that direction. Who knows?
Yep, but it's again, you kind of, if you have multiple perspectives, it helps a ton.
Yeah, preseason football. You touched upon it a little when there was that season in 2020, and we didn't get any information about people. They just kind of abandoned the preseason. I used to get a lot of tidbits from preseason football, and I could use that for even half the teams. I only can use it for about 5 or 6 teams now. What I learn in the preseason, can they stop the run? Are they not stopping the run? Are they all of a sudden placing an emphasis on the pass rush? Of course, we know about 7 of the teams won't even dress their starters. Do you care at all about preseason results? I'm not talking about the betting of the games, which I know you've endorsed, but just after the preseason is all over, can you still learn something that you can apply to the regular season?
I think you can learn more oftentimes from what's not shown in a lot of the games. So, like, for instance, a team I'm really curious, they play tonight, the Giants they're playing their starters. So Dayball comes in as the head coach. He was extremely pass heavy in New England, or in Buffalo, pardon me.
Buffalo.
His pass rates were through the roof. He was really aggressive on early downs. And a lot of what's been going on in camp from the reporter's side is like, we've never seen this much motion. We've never seen a Giants offense look like this and move like this. If they come out against the Patriots tonight and it's run, it's like, okay, how much of this is because they're actually a big shift coming and it's not putting anything out there on tape versus trying to decipher if they come out and it's the complete opposite. It's like, okay, is this reflective of what we can expect? And so I think that type of information where there's drastic changes, I'm thinking Minnesota is another team that's going to be similar with O'Connell stepping in as a very offensive coach from a defensive coach, big personnel shifts expected. Do we see a lot of that in preseason if the starters are on the field? Or do we see the opposite? Because we know from camp he's saying he's going to do things different. Well, so is that sort of confirming the tell if he's going to do the opposite? So there's a lot of that goes on. That's where I think it's valuable, more so than sort of gauging talent. I don't think I'm good enough to look at a group of linebackers in preseason and be like, yeah, these guys it's a step up. But I think you can piece together the coaching information relatively well.
I just remind people that when the Lions went 0-16, they were 4-0 in preseason. And I believe even there's been some really atrocious teams that have gone 4-0 in preseason and finished with 1 or 2 wins. So I want to ask you, I was on VSiN recently, and you commented to Gil that I was divulging too much in a recent discussion about the market or something else. What were you referencing on that, and what lines were crossed?
No, he thought that was about you. Because that was about Mike Craig, who went on from Right Angle.
Oh, okay.
But I think you guys were on in the same segment or the same hour, right?
Yeah, we were.
I won't go into what I thought he gave away way too much. So I'm not even going to bring it up what he was getting into, but I thought that was one of the more misleading interviews Gil has ever done. In addition to you, he's had a lot of brilliant guests on, but I was messaging him after the fact, and I was like, I wonder what percent of people actually understood what he was really saying in that segment. And it was about college football, but some process stuff about evaluating teams. And I was listening to it, and just bells were going off in my mind. But that was what that was about.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
I didn't think I gave away too much, so that's why I was asking. So go ahead, Ron.
Okay. So Chris and I, we self-critique a lot, putting words in Chris's mouth, where we know how our record was each year, what we've done, and so on. And I go a little bit deeper. Like this morning, I tweeted out where I am with my 131 college power ratings and stuff like that. So, I'm going through this process, and I'm going through historical data, and I don't discount historical data. I want to know what I've done with each conference, with each NFL team, and so on and so forth. Is that something you do at all? Do you care about what your record was last year or this year, or what a team ran for, or what their sack total was in 3-year rolling period?
Yeah, I definitely care about the team numbers. From a self perspective, I would say I'm more aware or better at identifying specific types of bets that I was making and what went well and what didn't. Last year, I can think of a number of bets that I played probably Monday morning, early Monday afternoon in just the most basic, simple situations where it'd be like, I think this team is just way better. And I didn't overthink it, and I clicked it, and I knew that it was at times relatively square, especially a lot of bets pertaining to the Cowboys. And I was like, this is not a bet I'd usually make, but I was like, this feels right. Everything lines up. Didn't overthink it. There were a lot of those in 2021 that went my way. And there were also a lot later in the season where I had a lot of success evaluating performance versus schedule. The biggest bet I made last year in the regular season was the Dolphins-Titans game. Chris, I think you were on the Titans -3 as well. But that was a situation where Miami had won, it was like 7 or 8 games in a row. But it was backup quarterbacks, third-string quarterbacks, teams without wide receivers. A lot of that really worked for me. And I know that that's worked for a long time. And so to me, the self-evaluation side is more so as we get into 2022. Like, I know right away, looking ahead to games coming up, when those situations could potentially play out. And there's almost more confidence in those evaluating what I've bet on in the past. And so it's not so much saying like, okay, I've been really good betting this team and I've been really on with them, or I've been way off with this team. That I don't get to that level. Because I think that messes me up a little bit with how I think about teams. But from that betting angle side, I've noticed a lot of that coming through. And maybe it's just experience over time doing this for long enough now that it pops up. But that's, I think, where I'm getting pretty good.
When I still need to do my 2021 NFL analysis, I call it the autopsy. And I'm just dreading it because it's a lot of work. And to reference what you were saying, I track everything. I mean, literally everything. What my record is over the last 7-8 years, betting on or against certain teams.
Yeah.
And in that specific point, it's kind of disappointing because, New England in 2020, or in Indianapolis in 2020 was my bread and butter. And then, I come back the next year and they're not helping you out. So sometimes you can get some sort of a loyalty sort of mixed in. Hey, I've been winning with this team. That's great. I got to keep that up. And that's not necessarily true. And
right.
With the inverse also. But I'm tracking, home dogs, road favorites, records versus teams. Each week of the season, what my record is week 1 through week 16, 17. I'm just coming up with it all just to see, what I can extrapolate from each of it. I see Ron looks like he wants to say something on the matter too.
Well, I mean, it's just so important for me, especially in the college game, because I want to know if I bet on a team, my last 9 bets were on this particular team, and I'm missing something because I keep having a bullish feeling about them, and I'm 4 and 5 on those bets. Now that's an incredibly low sample size, but what am I missing? The fact that for 2.5 years, I haven't bet on a certain college or on a certain NFL team. So I want to do a deeper dive to say, okay, now that I've looked at it, I'm okay with this. Or now that I've looked at it, I've really missed something. I've overvalued something. So, and I'm looking at new coach data all the time, NFL and college. How am I doing?
Yeah.
How are they doing? When's their bye week? Because that's really important to me. It happened with the Philadelphia Eagles last year. They had an earlier bye week. The next thing you know, instead of running 20, what did they do? They ran 22.5 times per game the first 6 weeks, and then they ran 39 times per game after that. New coaches cannot, in a normal week-to-week setting, have the time to shift gears. So that early buy is important. So I'm evaluating everything and tossing the stuff out that doesn't work and hopefully improving in other areas.
If I had the detail on the bets that I've made that you have, Chris, I would not sleep comfortably at night because I would be so concerned about moving one direction or betting at a certain hour. Or I think everything's different. At the same time, Ron, like if I had to track 131 college teams, I wouldn't be able to think straight. So I think the NFL makes it a lot more friendly in that so many games are kind of close to 50-50 propositions so often that it's really kind of just general thoughts that can guide you through. But when you get into the details of like deep into the 80s and 90s of college football teams down the power rankings, like you miss one thing and you're off by 7-8 points. You're not ever going to be that far off in the NFL. So
I'd like to mention a tweet I sent out yesterday. 538 evaluated this last year and said 24% of finals were basically toss-ups. So that would be games that had a 60% probability or less within the final 5 minutes to win or lose the game. Obviously, most games are within one score in the point spreads, but the point spread data would certainly be a little different. But, it's important to get these bad bounce games, these toss-up games each year. Is there anything that drives you nuts about the variance of so many games just being toss-ups?
I mean, maybe for a little bit on the Sunday morning or afternoon when you're watching it come in, but it's almost honestly like this is the first year I've had anything to do with baseball, and it's none of my doing. That we have a guy who's just phenomenal with MLB props, and he's playing like 5, 6, 7 a day. So I'm watching it, and I bet some of them that are really big just following him. And like everything is half a strikeout, half an inning pitched here or there. Like it is so dialed in. And I know people say the same thing about the NFL. And mathematically, if you look at it, like I get it, it's essentially the same thing. And then maybe it's an experience thing, but I feel like with the NFL, you can kind of see it coming or feel it coming, and it's not just constant shock and surprise. A sport like baseball, I think back to like days of basketball in the late 2000s. It felt completely out of control, and you never knew what was happening. At least I feel with football, it was like the Lions last year were a perfect example. They were always trailing. They were always behind. They were always playing catch up. But like you knew what the team was going to shift into when they were playing from behind and how their tendencies would change. And they
weren't going to give up.
Yeah, you could see a lot of those coming. When it's like a sport like baseball or basketball, it's completely out of control. So
I agree.
I don't know, maybe I've just learned to handle it or I'm numb to it, but I find it a lot less offensive in the NFL than other sports.
Ron, comment?
No comment on that one. I just know that when I'm going through 131 college teams, it's not as slow as it's not as terrible as you think, because I have data that carries over from one year to the next. So I'm I'm really rolling it over. If you're starting from scratch, forget it. And then there's certain teams not as. I mean, the NFL is a business. College is a business. 29 new coaches in college. 144. Brad Powers said new coordinators in college. Not even counting position coaches. So you can't keep historical data. You have to know the scheme is going to change in one way or another and adjust or try to be ahead of the public. 9 new coaches in the NFL. So that's all about the preseason changes. And I would go one step further. Indianapolis defensive coordinator, you mentioned, he's now in Minnesota. Is that correct?
Eberflus went to Chicago.
To Chicago, I'm sorry.
Yep.
Okay, so what does that mean for Indianapolis, who's very passive pass defense in the past few years? Yep. If that changes, they're a much more interesting team to me.
Oh, that's 100% it. Yep.
So it's fun to do this, but I don't have time to do it in September, October, November. That's why we're doing it in May, June, July, August to get ready for this.
I will say that part of me probably would think that I would be a better sports bettor if I was born and raised in the States, had access to all the college football games, and was like immersed into that. Obviously, the NFL is very different, but that was always, anytime I tried to think about college, just like getting the teams in my head and where everything is situated and the relationship between colleges and coaches and everything, like it's such an undertaking from my perspective. But again, if you're in it, I could understand that side about how it carries over and becomes a lot less daunting. But like to start from zero,
forget it. Forget it.
It's just too much. So
Yes.
That's a lot of where my comments come from, I think.
I used to take the summers off. 14, 15 years in a row, I just took 100 days off because I get no days off during, most of the year. So I still, took fewer days off per year than your average 9-to-5er. But nevertheless, I would come back and know nothing about the NFL, and I did just fine with my metrics. And now I've pivoted to wanting to just have familiarity, like you said, Adam, with just give me some familiarity. Let me get some context of what the hell's going on, what may or may not, be important to a team in the regular season. And hopefully that's going to help me out. But I don't get carried overboard with the prep that I have to bet now, because I feel like the regular season process is going to be just fine.
Yep.
We're going to do something different. We're going to pause. We're going to actually end this as part one. I've been, hard chopping. I'm not a media guy. I'm a bettor. I've chopped the last 2 interviews. We're going to end part one, but I promise you that there's a lot of questions still left of value that might have Adam kind of sweating a little bit possibly. So tune into.
There's a meal service being delivered right now for halftime here, right? That's what you guys do with guests.
So we're going to end part one. Make sure you see part 2. There's a lot of quality content left over. So we'll see you over there.